Hello, and welcome again to the History of England. I think today I'm going to begin by talking about the way the British people lived at this time. The British roundhouse, the Roman villas, the Anglo-Saxon halls, they all disappeared. So what we know of how people lived in England is mostly through digs and some conjecture. We know that 11th and 12th centuries, the standard house in England consisted of one square room on the ground floor, another square room built above it, and the second floor usually granted by means of an external staircase. The furniture was simple, had not changed since the time of the Anglo-Saxons. It consisted usually of a board laid on trestles where people ate, and there was also a wood bench to sit on. Now, in houses that are built of stone, there would be an alcove for sitting. There are some stools and some chairs. If you were poor, if you were a little richer, noble, you had a little more, of course. The rich would have chests and coffers and cupboards, but most people didn't. Most people laid at night on a bed, which is a bag of straw laid upon a carved frame. Now, the richer sort, they had houses of stone, but most houses are built of wood and thatched with straw and reeds and heather, which is why they don't exist anymore. The windows would not have glass in them, but most houses did have wooden shutters that could be barred at night for safety and comfort. The house is always drafty, and yet it is also smoky. The lower floor tended to be a living room and a kitchen, and upper floor, the bedroom. There might be a wooden booth in front of the house to sell goods, and behind the house, there might be a warehouse where goods were manufactured, but this is not always the case. And last time we talked about how the Vikings are still coming to England. They were searching for plunder and slaves, and they're also finding their own relatives because the English and the Vikings had settled in England over the centuries. And we talked about the reign of Ethelred Unready, whose policy is to pay off the Vikings or massacre them in retaliation, depending on how he got up out of bed that morning. And I talked about how the one thing he did that made him good, made him bad, is he married Emma Normandy, the sister of the Duke of Normandy, in 1002. And then the Vikings came, they placed their own man on the throne in 1013, but then after he died, Ethelred came back to fight for his kingdom, but then he died, and his son and the son of a Viking king, a man named Canute, divided England between them, and then later Canute took all of England, ruling as part of his empire until 1035. And I kind of talked about what the new king, who ended up following Canute, eventually a man named Edward the Confessor, hated by most English, because he appointed Normans to important posts. And after Edward died in January 1066, he appointed Harold Godwinson to the throne as his heir, though William, the Duke of Normandy, claimed the throne was his by right. Now, finally, we talked about how William came a-calling in the fall of 1066 and managed to take England after defeating Harold in the Battle of Hastings, and then took London and was crowned King of England. So today I'm going to look at his role, as well as the reigns of his two sons in the Norman dynasty. To the victor goes the spoils. Now, once William I was King of England, he set about ordering his new kingdom. His first task was to confiscate the estates of those who had fought against him. He also raised a large sum of money with a new and sudden tax, because he's greedy above all. And another sign he tended to stay around for a long time was that wherever he went, he had a castle built. For instance, the Tower of London can be dated from this period, at least it starts. I mean, Tower of London is huge, it's a vast complex of various castles, but it starts at this point. Now, William was helped in all these endeavors by many of those who served Harold, for William quickly realized that he needed experience and knowledge of the English. He didn't have that. And the English lords and monasteries agreed to serve him. He kept them in place. If they did not, he was not a man who suffered fools gladly. Now, at first William was saying he was king of England, but he really only controlled the southeast England, and those who supported Harold fled to the southwest around Exeter. And 2 years after the Battle of Hastings in 1068, William left for Normandy, and they raised the flag of rebellion. The Irish and the Danes joined them, and William quickly realized that he didn't do something about it. The rebellion would spread to the north and west of England, and he'd lose England. So he returned, he marched his army to Exeter, He laid siege to the city, and 18 days later the city surrendered. But revolt was in the air. The year afterwards, 1069, the northern counties of England, with the help of the Danes, seized York. And William marched north. He planted castles as he went, but instead of directly attacking York, he simply ran around the city. He did the same tactics he had done in London in 1066, laying waste to everything around the city of York. Now, this act became known as the Harrowing of the North and consisted of nothing less than the wholesale destruction of all people and towns in his path. Wherever he went, man and animals were killed, crops were destroyed, towns and villages laid waste. All the reserves of food burned, which created a widespread famine. 100,000 people, we think, died because of this. No cultivated land was left between York and Durham, and 100 years later, the ruins of destruction could still be seen. The North, however, would never again rise against William, for, like the Romans, he had made a desert and called it peace. He had not behaved like an English king was supposed to in matters like this. He had behaved like a tyrant. And because of this, other local insurrections kept happening, and many of the English formed into guerrilla bands, and then they would harass the Norman invaders. 10,000 Normans were attempting to control a country of about 4 million, and their only weapons were brute power and terror. And William kept spies and collaborators on his payroll throughout England, often handed out to those who involved in rebellions beatings and executions. But they continued and continued. Somewhere in England, there's a rebellion every year between 1067 and 1070. So William said, okay, enough's enough. He sped up his confiscation of lands held by the English and placed them in the hands of the Normans. By the time he died, only 2 English barons still had lands they had held in 1066. The rest had new owners. Most of these great estates went to Normans, who promised in return to provide knights to the king. England had become a militarized state and supported an army of occupation. The owners of the small states, they managed to hold on to the land, but only at great expense. Many of them forced to become tenants on land they once owned, and others, well, who held out, they were roughly treated until they surrendered. And there are other changes in the landscape that we can document. For instance, by 1100, all the English cathedrals were either being rebuilt or newly constructed, larger and more massive than the ones that had come before. Their naves were longer, the side chapels proliferated. The Normans loved to build. They loved to show off their art in this way. And of course, one of those ways was the Norman castles. I stated already, William refused to stop anywhere for the night without having a castle built there, starting the next morning. You know those signs out east in the United States, George Washington slept here? Well, in England, William I slept here. How we know? Here's a darn castle. Now, the Norman castle tended to be a square mass of masonry with extraordinary thick walls and tiny windows. It's not like the castles we know. Those castles we'll get to. These are very short, square pieces of masonry. They're gloomy. For those forced to live there, well, it was really a despairing place to live. They're homes, yes, but they're prisons and fortresses and courthouses and barracks. The native English saw them, and they saw them everywhere, and they hated them. They're a sign of the repressors, yet they are also a magnificent creation, born out of the will to control and hold power, something the Normans possessed. The English landscape has also changed in other ways. For instance, hundreds of monasteries planted across the country, deer parks and rabbit warrens created, great swaths of land set aside as forests, where all the fruit and animals of the forests and fields in the area belonged only to the king, and the king alone. If you violated that, you were blinded. That law covered a third of England. A third of England belonged to the king. Another great division was created by language. The new ruling elite spoke Norman French. The new subjects of William spoke English, of course. Now, English and Latin are still used in administrative matters. The fact that the ruling group spoke another language created greater problems. Certain English words are hard to pronounce, and so they became corrupted over time. Snottingham became Nottingham. Dunhallam became Durham. Shipton, Skipton. Yarrow, Jarrow. Now, William did attempt to learn English to be able to dispense justice, but this was a skill he could not master. In fact, the language of the law over the centuries has become saturated with words from the French: contract, agreement, covenant, master, servant, crime, treason, felony, money, payment, all French. The English also were showing they're different. They continued to wear their hair long. The Normans kept theirs short. Oh, but of course, over time, the Normans did start to grow their hair long, but that took time. Most things, however, were not changed in England. English law administration survived. Normans had no written law. They had to use what they now controlled. The English Thane was to be now called a knight, but the purpose was still the same. The names changed, the institutions did not. There's still the hundreds, there's still the shires, there's still the tithing, there's still the sheriffs and the county courts, all the same, always like they had been. The privileges and customs of towns were maintained. Taxes are still raised in the same way. Military service is still the same as it's always been. The people who made the coins are still the English. Writs are issued the same way. I could go on and on and on. An essential part of what William kept was the English church. He did introduce a number of Norman reforms and Norman clergy, so everything would look like he was used to. And by 1087, only 3 of the 21 abbots in England were English. Okay. And the Norman abbots, they're mostly not sympathetic to the English inferiors. For instance, the abbot of Abingdon refused to keep the feast of English saints on the principle that English are rustics. And the Glastonbury abbot kept an armed retinue of Norman archers to shoot his own monks when they protested against the imposition of a new liturgy. But there were some Norman churchmen who did love their English subjects. For instance, the abbot of Shelby helped to build the first stone church for his community. He personally dressed like the laborers. He did the work of the laborers, and he took the pay he was given and then handed out to the poor. And William also appointed an Italian named Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury. Lanfranc already lived in the Norman Abbey of Bec. He was friendly to William. He was respected. He was a learned and pious man, like many of those who followed him in the English church. Now, he drew up the first principles of canon law for England, and William agreed that all spiritual matters should be addressed in ecclesiastical courts. It's under his leadership that the great cathedrals of England rose. He brought in monastic discipline to the rebellious English monks, and in 1076 he passed a decree that no English cleric would be allowed to marry. Now, the Pope blessed this move by William, but it must be made clear the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and William did not get along. William said, "I'm the master of England, not some far-off pontiff who never stood foot on my island. If a papal election was ever divided, the victor would not be recognized in England without William's permission." He made it clear. No papal letter would be allowed to enter England without William reading it first, and no papal legate would ever enter England without his personal approval. He would be the one who would sanction the appointment of bishops. He would be the one who would sanction the appointment of abbots. And this running argument would continue off and on for centuries until the final break at the time of the Reformation, and we will talk about that. Now, the one important matter we have coming from William is, of course, the so-called Doomsday Book, the King's Book. It's called the Doomsday Book because it's known that its evidence can no more be invaded than the day of doom. It's a survey of the entire kingdom of William I, all the resources in one place, so the king can make plans accordingly. Every shire is visited by officials who are to find out what each landholder had in land, what each landholder had in livestock, what it was all worth. It is interesting that what we have in this book is so copious and detailed, in single and double columns written in Latin. The officials must have made use of earlier records. There's no way they could have copied all this stuff down in the year that they had. Over 13,000 locations are described. Most of these areas are still part of England. Nothing was overlooked. For instance, the places were around London and around York, which William had destroyed, were all called devastated lands. The Domesday Book was commissioned by William at Christmas time 1085 and was completed the following year, which shows again that such speed is only possible if they had existing records. Now, it must be noted that the main reason William had this done was so that he would be able to have documentation and evidence of transfers of land from the English landholders to his Norman friends. It was also used for the efficient raising of taxes and for accurate imposition of military service. The book was also used for William to be able to summon all the chief landholders to Salisbury, where they swore loyalty to him, like they had in 1066. And now he knew both the extent of what they owned and what they made in a year. And he reminded them that they held their lands only because he had granted it to them. Now, the original Domesday Book rests behind a glass in the National Archives in Kew, England, by the way, if you ever want to go see it. It's outside London. I've never seen it. I will one day. Now, we can learn a lot from this book. For instance, we learned at the time England is made up of 35% arable land, 15% woodland, 30% pasture, 1% meadow. The rest is mountain and fen and heath and waste and wild. We learned that the manor brought in by the Danes and Saxons was the backbone of agrarian and economic life. The manor by this time means an estate of land in which the tenants were bound by fealty to one lord. His land was either next to the manor house or scattered in strips among the fields. There were free and unfree tenants. The free tenants paid the manor lord rent for the acres. They were obliged to help at the harvest and planting time. Otherwise, they were able to do what they wanted. The unfree tenants, however, performed weekly labor service, such as threshing and winnowing, and were either slaves or were free with labor contracts. In late 1086, William went back to Normandy. He would never again set foot in England. He went on to campaign to expand the borders of Normandy and became gravely ill due to heat and exhaustion during the summer of 1087. He refused to go rest, and he was hurt further when his horse jumped a ditch and his internal organs ruptured. He was taken to the priory at Rouen, France, where he died on September 9th, 1087. And while being buried at the monastery of St. Stephen in Caen, his body burst open. He was unable to fit in the hole that had been dug for it, and mourners ran from the building because of the foul stench. What an end to William the Bastard. Now, William left the Duchy of Normandy to his eldest son, Robert, and England to his second son, William Rufus. His youngest son, Henry, was given 5,000 pounds of silver. Now, this division of spoils of William would cause many problems in years to come. But since this is the story of England, let's look at England. As I stated, William Rufus, or William the Red, because of his red face, his red beard, and his red temper, was a new king, William II. He was short, and he was fat, and he was very strong, but he was not clever. He was not faithful. He was not humble. And in a rage, he would stammer and speak in short sentences. But he did love to joke, and he loved to outrage his clerical advisors with blasphemous remarks. He was a man who loved to boast. He was always cheerful. He was extravagant. He was bold. Now, as a young man, he had been devoted to the interests of his father. He believed that if he did this, he'd be rewarded later on. He never left Normandy until he was in his 20s, and he did not speak English. But while his father was dying, he left in order to cross the English Channel to claim his kingdom, and at the age of 31 was crowned in Westminster Abbey by Archbishop Lefranc. The liturgy was Anglo-Saxon, the language French and Latin. Now, William II, as he's now known, at once ran into trouble. Some of his Norman lords in England, they raised a rebellion. They favored his brother Robert. So he used an English army to put this rebellion down, and in the spring of 1091, he marched his army north because Malcolm of Scotland had invaded the northern part of England after sending raiders into that part of the country during the reign of William I. Now, William Rufus captured Cumbria, which is controlled at that time by the Scots, and then he captured Carlisle. He sent the people of the town of Carlisle into exile, and he brought in English farming families to resettle the area, which withdrew the northwestern frontiers of England, and that's pretty much the boundary of England to this day. He also started to take over Welsh lands. He planted castles as he moved forward, like his father, but in the end he was beaten by the Welsh. He only managed to hold on to Glamorgan and Pembroke. Now this is the usual way of William II on the battlefield. Never totally successful, never totally defeated. And he needed more money. A constant running sore with him. He's always fighting his enemies in Scotland and Wales and Normandy and Northumberland, and he loved to do this. He felt he was most alive and most kingly when he was fighting. But in early 1093, he fell sick. His advisors urged him to make peace with God, repent of his sins. He must have felt it difficult to know where to go, but he settled on one great sin. After Lanfranc died in 1090, he left vacant the Archbishopric of Canterbury so that he could enjoy the revenues that came in. So now he acted by appointing a new abbot of Bec, Anselm, to the vacant see. And he summoned Anselm to his side, but Anselm refused. He knew that William II was not a man he could trust, not a man he could work with. And William angrily ordered Anselm to take the post, and again, Anselm refused. So William ordered everyone in the room to prostrate themselves before Anselm. And at which point Anselm got down on his knees. He begged William to find someone else. And William then grabbed the pastoral staff and had the fingers of Anselm pried open. And he only got one finger, but he wrapped that finger around that pastoral staff, and he quickly read out the order of office. And then they carried Anselm to the nearest church, and he's made archbishop. But then William recovered. And of course, he immediately reneged on everything he had promised on his deathbed, so Anselm knew he'd been right. But now there's nothing he could do about it. Now, Anselm had a deep respect for the office of Archbishop of Canterbury. He believed that he was equal in power to the king when it came to spiritual matters. And so he often went to William and lectured him on his duties, and William hated that. And Anselm would order William to fill all the vacant sees in England and stop collecting the money for himself. And finally, Anselm decided enough was enough, and he left England. And he headed for Rome to beg the Bishop of Rome, give me permission to resign. But the Bishop of Rome said no. Anselm refused to return to England. He said, while William lives, I will choose a life of exile. Interestingly enough, William supposedly, the stories go, came down to the sea shore when Anselm was leaving. He shouted at the boat, I've hated you as now as I hated you the minute I met you. Go and never come back again. That's the story, though. We don't know. But like his father, William II was always on the move, and whenever he went, the court went with him. Now this meant everything was loaded onto carts and taken wherever the king was going to spend the night. And this meant a parasite courtiers would follow along with servants and prostitutes, resembling a small army, always moving. And wherever they went, the courtiers would steal what they wanted. And whole towns were devastated, whole villages. And it showed that the real power of England was based on violence and greed. And the court is also a scandal in and of itself, because William II was not married. His close companions, it was rumored, were sodomites in the term of the day. Now this is a common theme among warrior elites of the day. In fact, as I said, William never married, never had any children, legitimate or illegitimate. Most likely a practicing homosexual, based on evidence which we have, which is that William was always surrounded by effeminate men who wore their hair long in ringlets and wore extravagant costumes and makeup. And William always made it a standing order that all lamps would be doused every night. So whatever happened in the dark would stay in the dark. But William II could not live forever, and his end came on August 2nd, 1100. He was hunting in the New Forest, one of the large stretches of land set aside for the king. As he's leaving for the hunt, he was handed 6 arrows by a local blacksmith. William kept 2 of them. He handed the other 4 to a companion named Walter Terrill. And they sat down for a large meal and enough wine and drink that would floor many a temperate person. And then they set off on their own, and they separated from the others so they could shoot the deer that were driven toward them. And here comes a deer. And the king shoots first, and he wounds the stag. And then Walter shoots, but he accidentally hits William in the chest. Accidentally. William staggered, and he falls onto the arrow. Goes out his back. He's dead. Walter panics. He flees from the scene. Now, that's the second version of the story. In truth, we cannot question it. We were not there. None of the chroniclers of the day seem to doubt his death was a pure accident. But the death of a king arouses suspicion. For instance, his younger brother Henry was in the party. Maybe he hoped that with William out of the way, he would be named new king. Then again, it could have been a Norman assassin hired by Richard, who really wanted England for himself. It could have been a private enemy, taking advantage of the king being in the forest. We'll never know. So we'll stick with the story we have, okay? Thank you. Now, it's interesting that this king, who's such a bad king, is remembered chiefly by the people of England for his death. And through this memory, they tend to lighten his memory. He was a bad king. He exploited the realm for his own benefit. He attempted to make it larger, so he had more power. He achieved little as a king, but maybe it's because he managed to keep the country united under his Roman dynasty. It was enough. His bleeding body was taken to Winchester. It was quietly buried under the tower. The tower crumbled and collapsed a few years later. We have no grave marker now. We do have the completed White Tower in the Tower of London, which he had ordered completed as his father started to build it. We do have Westminster Hall. He had that built. And we have the rebuilt London Bridge, even though a flood washed that one away later. Now, as soon as he heard the news that his elder brother William was dead, Henry rode quickly to Winchester. He seized the royal treasury. And 3 days later, on August 5th, he was crowned Henry I at Westminster. Now, Henry had spent his life being constantly bullied and bribed by Robert and bullied and bribed by William. As a father of control of Normandy, but he saw England as the far greater prize. He didn't care about Normandy. He was reserved. He was cautious. He was literate. He spoke Latin. And unlike his elder brother William, he loved the woman. He fathered at least 20 bastards. Now, when he swore his coronation oath, he swore to undo the wrongs committed by his elder brother. He invited Anselm to come back to Canterbury, which Anselm accepted. He gained the loyalty of the principal magnates by using patronage. He extinguished private wars between barons, and he married Edith, the niece of the new king of Scotland, who was linked by blood with Anglo-Saxon kings and is therefore a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. Thus, the English now, for the first time, accepted the Norman dynasty, even though Edith changed the name of Matilda to honor the mother of Henry. Now, Henry wanted to consolidate his domain. So 40 years after the Normans had invaded, 40 years after they conquered, they invaded and conquered Normandy. In the Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry captured his elder brother, Duke Robert. He took him to England, where Robert would spend the rest of his life in chains. Now, for Henry, this was an important battle. The lands of his father united again under one monarch. The country now settled into a peaceful region as Henry turns thoughts to peace, including starting a ferry service between Southampton and Dieppe, and introducing the rabbit to England. Yay! Now, Henry kept the borders of Scotland at what they were then when he took over, but he refused to make them larger. He did encourage Anglo-Normans to go to Wales, and he consolidated various Welsh princesses in order to build Wales into the English colony, but besides this, he didn't touch Wales. He didn't touch Scotland. He was a strong king, not necessarily a benevolent one. He was only concerned with what interested him, and so the government of England became a form of state management, in which all the available assets of land were exploited. For instance, he oppressed and taxed abbeys, ignoring a series of bad habits. He would keep the taxes high, and people couldn't pay. He had the property seized and the person executed. And if a person had nothing to give, he was left to die in the famine. But he also took care to support and protect those who supported him. When the coinage was debased with tin and Henry's army complained that their pay was worthless, Henry had all the coiners in England castrated, and the right hands amputated as warnings. And he kept the English nobles on his side by giving royal gifts and allowances. But he didn't want to fall into the same trap that William II had fallen into. So he made sure that all his bastard daughters were married off into the various ruling families of Europe. He married his one legitimate daughter, Matilda, to the Prince of Anjou. And he kept his close eye on the nobles, ending any rebellion they had planned before they could put their plans into motion. But there's one event he could not foresee. One event. On November 25th, 1120, his 16-year-old son and heir, William Adelin, was due to sail from Normandy to England. And he had a little party with him, and the party went on board the White Ship. And they're going to have a party on their way across, but the crew and the passengers were drunk. And the ship crashed against a large rock underneath the water and sank. The heir to the throne drowned, along with many of the younger members of nobility. One man did survive. That's Stephen, the Count of Blois. Now, he was also the nephew of Henry, and since he had been sick with diarrhea, he had refused to go on the ship and cross the English Channel, so he had survived. But Henry had a major problem. One legitimate heir, Matilda. He'd fathered no more children after 1120, legitimate or illegitimate, but no woman had ever sat on the throne of England. But Henry was not deterred. He gathered the principal barons of England to Westminster Hall and had them all swear that they would support Matilda as the new queen when he died. And of course they swore, after all. Who would not say yes when saying no meant losing all? So next time we're going to examine what occurred after Henry I died. And we're going to discover if the barons supported Matilda or did they choose someone else to follow as king. Stay thirsty, my friends. Stay thirsty.